So let's go over to func.inc.php. Let's come down and create our shorten function. Okay, so as shown when we called it in url.php, we need the URL and code. So let's go ahead here and type in URL, comma, code. Okay, so the URL is obviously susceptible to SQL injection when we use our query inside of here. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to escape the data. Okay, so the code doesn't need escaping because it's automatically generated and it escapes here. Well, actually, it's not. So we could re-escape it, but because it's not user, it's not user defined, we don't need to. But let's go ahead and do it anyway, just for the purposes of this. So MySQL real escape string URL, and let's copy that line, come down, and just change this to code and code. Okay, so we've escaped the data, and now what we want to do is actually insert this value. Okay, so we just don't need to assign this MySQL query to a variable. We just say MySQL query insert into, remember our table is URLs, that's over here, there, and we want to insert the values. First of all, nothing, because that's just the auto incrementing field. Then we want to insert another two. So the first one is URL and then code. Okay, so this shorten is going to escape the data from the URL and the code. It's then going to insert this into our database, so we should have the URL and the code inserted into a new record, and then we want to return the code. Okay, and that's going to be displayed back out to the user because this will return the code. Now we don't need to do it this way. What we could do is take this function and put it above this echo and then just echo out the code that we've already generated here. Okay, but I'm just doing it this way because I prefer it and it keeps things simpler. Okay, so we return the code after we've inserted it, and then we get this passed back as we've already seen to our field. So let's go ahead and update these. Now what we can do is check when we do actually, let's just get rid of this, when we do actually enter a URL, we can check that the data has been inserted. So if we click on browse, you can see that the table seems to be empty. It says here we've got no results. MySQL returned an empty result set. We've got nothing in our database. Let's go ahead and type in phpacademy.org. Press enter, and successfully shortened your URL. So we've got this code here, which is 5UA capital M BM. Let's go over here and click browse, and you can now see that we've got the URL. Remember, URL ID is incremented to 1. We've got http://phpacademy.org, and we've got that code there, which matches that code there. So later, when the user comes here and pastes this into a separate window, or posts it into their blog or Twitter, we then correspond the code to the URL and forward the user to this URL. So that's essentially the basic concept of the URL shortener, which hopefully you already understood prior to me showing you here. Okay, so now that we've generated this and we've inserted it into the database, we now need to create a function that's going to redirect the user to the URL that corresponds to this code, and that will be entered in the form like that into the URL into the browser, and we need to actually pick this variable up, or pick this / up, rather than as a / and this being a folder. At the moment you can see that the folder was not found. We actually need to process this as a variable. So there's a way that we're going to do this, and I'm going to show you how to write out the htaccess in a moment, but the first thing we're going to do is actually create the function that's going to redirect the user. So let's call the function redirect, and we're going to call this, instead of from our url.php, we're going to call this from index.php, and we're going to call this up here in some tags above all of our code, okay, because we're going to be using the header function to redirect the user. So now what we need to do is we need to take in a code in here. We need to redirect the user depending on the code that is appended to our URL, meaning this thing here. Okay, so the redirect function is going to look something like this. Now is the time when escaping this data is really important, because obviously the user could specify anything after the / and could inject data or inject things into our database. So we're going to redefine the code variable, and that's going to be equal to MySQL real escape string code. So we're basically protecting ourselves and reassigning the code to a new variable, or the same variable but just overwriting what was already there. Okay, so now what we need to do is actually check if the code exists, because if the code doesn't exist, we're going to be checking, we're going to be redirecting the user to a value that might not be in the database. So now what we can do is say if code exists, code, do something here. Okay, so our code exists function, remember we created earlier up here, which takes in the code, selects the count where the code is in the database, and it returns whether it's true or false. So if the code cannot be found, this block here won't be run. So that's very important, because we don't want to redirect the user to a page that, well, a URL in our table that doesn't exist. So now what we can do is we can say URL is equal to MySQL result. Remember, the MySQL result function takes three parameters, well, 2 parameters in the last case, but 3 in this case. We're going to have the query here, which I'm not going to use in obviously a string data. We want to select row 0 and the value URL. Okay, so now what we can do here is create the query. So in fact, what I'll do is I'll define this up here. So URL query is equal to MySQL query. We're performing a query there, and we're taking the result from this, and we're taking the query and putting it into the MySQL result function. So the query is as follows. Pretty straightforward. We're saying select URL. Remember, URL is the value here, which is phpacademy.org in a case that the code would equal this. So we're saying select URL from URLs, which is our table name, where code is equal to code. Okay, so we're selecting the URL where the code is equal to the code, and that's where the code exists is important, and also where the so where the code exists function is important, because if the code doesn't exist, this query will fail. Because if this code here was 5tghui, for example, the code doesn't exist because that doesn't match that, and there's no other records in the table. Therefore this query will fail, and this result will fail because it won't have found anything from the query, and then it's not going to work, essentially. So code is the code that's been specified from this redirect function, and then all we're doing is we're saying header location colon and a space in here, and we're appending on the URL. So this URL will be, in the case of code equaling 5UA-MBM, will be phpacademy.org. So this result here will actually be http://phpacademy.org, and then we're redirecting the user to phpacademy.org. Okay, so now we need to define this in index.php, and we're going to take this in the form of a get variable. So it will look something like this. We've got index.php, and then we're going to have $, redirect equals, and then the code here is going to be there. Okay, now this might look a bit confusing because this is not what we're generating for the user as a shortened URL, but in actual fact, when we type in the code here, the htaccess file will process it as that. So if you're confused, you'll see a bit later on in the htaccess how this is going to work. But for now, when we press enter, nothing's happening because we haven't done anything here. Okay, so remember we're working on index.php and index.php here. Okay.